Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining another session of this evolving landscape of privacy concerns in healthcare. I'm Ray Mina from FreshPain. I'll be the host today, but you shouldn't be here for me. You're here for this incredible panel of experts. And really what we're going to talk about today, I've been talking about how tracking technologies for marketing have been impacting healthcare because of privacy concerns for quite some time, and it's coming from a lot of different directions. But honestly, I never thought I'd be here with this panel today to talk about a shadow regulator in the form of cyber insurance. But that is a new area that we've learned about recently. And this is all part of a series that we're going to be doing for Fresh Paint. You can register for the entire series here. It's 3 parts. And we're going to dive pretty deep. Today, we're going to kind of like surface this and make sure we help you understand what are the concerns and what are some of the things you can do about it. And then future series will go even deeper there to help you get ahead of some of this stuff. But as I mentioned, I brought some friends and we've got some experts on this panel today. So I'd love for everyone to go around and make a quick introduction. Mallory, if we could start with you, that'd be great.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Mallory Goodwin. I am counsel here at Fenwick on our regulatory practice and insurtech practice group. I have been in the insurance industry for about 20 years, starting out as a claims handler, moving into coverage litigation, guiding clients on coverage placement. And then just prior to Fenwick, I also worked in-house for several insurtech startup companies, helping them sort of develop these new innovative insurance products. So always touching something in insurance in my professional life. I'm happy to be here with my fellow panelists and talk a little bit more about digital marketing and sort of the cyber liability coverage and risk part that goes with that.
And Andrew, we've already met, and you actually have a similar background on the insurance side. Yeah, tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Ray, and thanks for everybody for being here. Thanks for Beckers for hosting. I'm Andrew Carell. I wear a few different hats, but primarily, I like to help software companies and the cyber insurance industry kind of get to know each other a little better. And so how did I get here? I got my start back in 2012 as an insurance underwriter. So I did a lot of technology, and cyber underwriting back when, we couldn't sell this stuff. We had to go do a lot of almost door knocking, so to speak. So I've seen it evolve over the years. I've done some product development for cyber and professional lines. Worked in cybersecurity, so pretty well-rounded background, and yeah, very excited to talk about pixel tracking and its implications in cyber insurance.
And Emily, yeah, could you do the same? Let us know a little bit about your background.
Of course. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Davis. I'm the West Region Cyber and Technology Leader at Willis. I'm based in San Francisco. I've been in the cyber industry for about 11 years, both as claims counsel, and since 2018, I've been at Willis on the broking side. My focus is on large and complex risks, particularly in the healthcare space.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you all for being here. Again, I'm Ray. I'm the CMO of FreshPain. I handle marketing and product. I'm a marketer, performance marketing, and all the things related to like the ad technology and the acquisition strategies that healthcare uses. That's my area of expertise. I kind of like to say I've been in an internship from the legal aspect for the last 3 years, but I am not a lawyer. That's why there's some experts here to talk about it today. And a quick plug for FreshPaint, like we've been on a journey for the last 3.5 years helping healthcare teams from telehealth to providers to payers make sure they can continue to reach consumers and help promote their services in a meaningful way without getting tripped up by a lot of these different compliance and privacy concerns. And the one we're going to talk about today is not a regulator. It's actually like a cyber insurance broker that may be impacting the ability to have coverage or the premiums behind it. So I'm going to leave up the slide if people, while we're having this discussion, want to register for the full series. But I'd love to kick us off because I think I'm kind of blue in the face about talking about tracking technologies and pixels and what they're for. So I'd like to get a different perspective on it. Maybe I can go through the panel, starting with you, Mallory, if you can tell us a little bit about like what are pixels and trackers. When we say this, what are we actually talking about?
Sure. So When we're talking about pixels, really that's the broader category of a web tracker, right? So web tracker includes these pixel trackers as well as cookies, social media plugins, and sort of any other tool that you can think of that's monitoring online user activity. Basically anything that's taking user behavior and analyzing it so that it can then be used to display ads, personalized content. You might see retargeted ads. So that's the broader category. Now we're talking specifically sort of focusing on these pixels, right? So what is a pixel? A pixel is a small graphic or basically a snippet of code that you're going to see embedded in the HTML code of whether it's the website, your email, and it's going to be hidden, right? So that's a key part of these pixel trackers. They're hidden, they're intentionally embedded and camouflaged within these pages and emails. So what happens is when a user goes to open that web page, open that email, the pixel is activated and so begins monitoring and recording that user's activity. And that's when you have a tracking pixel. So tracking pixels are going to be recording the type of device, the type of operating system, the activities are performed, like what is the user doing? What are they clicking on? What are they viewing? What are they entering? IP addresses. So those are what pixels are. And, you know, we can talk about why sort of in the healthcare industry specifically, why we have to be very careful. Because what we don't want is sort of these tools sort of discreetly collecting this information about a user. And in a healthcare setting, you know, are they going to accidentally collect this PHI, this protected health information, and potentially sharing it without the user's knowledge?
And from the marketer's lens, for anybody on this call who's not a marketer, the answer would be like, why not just not have pixels at all? It's because modern marketing technologies rely on some level of data to even work in the first place. Like if you have no data, many of these tools like the Metas and Googles, they just don't work. So they're not effective tools anymore. So that's kind of the catch-22 we find ourselves in healthcare. Andrew, how would an underwriter get involved here? How would they even detect if these pixels exist on a healthcare marketing website?
Yeah, so the first thing we kind of start with from the underwriter's perspective is they're assessing risk. So they get introduced to the healthcare company when they're applying for cyber insurance. And an underwriter's job, first and foremost, is to make an informed decision on whether or not to accept the risk of a company. And part of that is to determine what's their likelihood of suffering a loss that would be covered by an insurance policy. The particular part of an insurance policy that we're probably most focused on is within the regulatory fines and penalties coverage. So this would cover whether or not an organization gets a fine or a penalty from a regulation like HIPAA or maybe a regulatory body like SEC, FTC, all the acronyms. And when it comes to pixel tracking technology, as Mallory alluded to, it's this protected health information. And so when you're looking at if that is unintentionally disclosed or not properly handled, you can run afoul of that. And if they do incur a fine or a penalty, well, who might be on the hook for that? The insurer. So they're going through this process of evaluating risk. And the second part of your question, how do they detect it? As Mallory mentioned, that the pixel trackers and other technologies that are used, one, they have the code embedded in the website, but more importantly, they communicate with an outside third party. And that communication, that when you're sending a packet via an IP address across that packet is detectable. And so they're using tracking technologies to see, there's a communication from end to end, and it's going to Meta, it's going to Google. And so they're able to detect, hey, there's the presence of this product. It's Metapixel, Google, maybe a full story or something, to that effect. and it raises the antennae, so to speak. Before this tracking technology, they're primarily leveraging questionnaires or applications for insurance, and they may have a very simple question: do you use tracking technologies in your marketing? And it's a simple yes/no question, but it's more nuanced than that. So those together are where they're starting the conversation, why it's important, and how they know that they may be in use in the first place.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy that a lot of this started with journalists actually doing site scans and actually detecting meta trackers and then going and doing like teardowns of like what might be shared. And then here we are 2.5 years later with a lot of different concerns about this. Emily, I'd love for you to double click on that. Andrew touched on it a little bit, but like, how are we seeing, on applications and questionnaires and reviews of this, how are we seeing questions come up directly about pixels from the insurance world?
Sure. So, touching on that, and also from the client side, what we're seeing and the conversations we're having, from the clients, we're certainly seeing an element of surprise. Many organizations didn't expect something as simple as a marketing tool to suddenly become a major cyber insurance issue. And that surprise can quickly turn to frustration when they have to go through the application process, because we're seeing the pixel tracking question sets becoming increasingly standard, especially for healthcare, financial, and the retail industries. Insurers are directly asking about tracking technology use, and then that forces clients to really dig into the weeds of what's actually installed on their websites. And often they're discovering far more tracking technology than they realized they had, and that can then kind of create tension between marketing, compliance, and the risk management teams. But there's a business challenge here. Even once clients understand the risk, as Ray said before, removing pixels isn't exactly simple. So, the short answer is clients are surprised and sometimes frustrated that these kind of question sets are popping up now, and often kind of a little confused as to why this is becoming a gating issue in their insurance renewal.
Can I add a little bit on Emily's point there? So this is a really interesting example of how, especially in larger organizations, different parts of the organization start interacting with each other almost unknowingly, right? Emily, you know this, and Mallory too. The part of the organization that buys insurance, whether it's cyber insurance or any other insurances, they're not in marketing. And so oftentimes they don't know all the tooling that is used, especially by marketing, like you said, Emily, seemingly innocuous. But it starts to bubble up to the top when insurance gets involved. Like, oh, like I had no idea. And yeah, so it's just like this little serendipity that is now coming up everyone's world.
Yeah, that's how a lot of this started initially when we first talked to the first marketers in healthcare, is that they were getting knocks on their door from the compliance and privacy team saying, we're getting sued. And marketers like, what do you mean, for what? And that took a lot of time to bridge that gap to understand how these things are now connected. Maybe a good part here, this is the part that I like, the whole tracking and pixels world I'm very familiar with, especially after the last few years. But the part that I don't quite get yet, which I'm really excited to hear from this panel, is what are the actual financial consequences for these pixels on the website? Like what are we seeing? Like, I think I've heard like customers directly telling me their claims were denied. They've seen premium hikes, maybe being threatened to lose coverage. Andrew, since you were just chimed in about this, maybe you can start and share a little bit about how our insurers from the insurance side, how are they currently viewing these trackers? Like, how are they starting to think about it?
Yeah, it depends on the insurance carrier, and there's kind of a spectrum of response. There is the very stringent approach, which is saying, hey, in the healthcare industry, if we see any pixel trackers, we're going to simply exclude them, right? It's too big of a risk, and we're just going to say, no, we detect it. Doesn't matter where it is. We're just declining it. And so you may see that show up in policy language. and exclusions. You may see it in the forms of declinations at time of underwriting or non-renewals. Other carriers are taking a more nuanced approach. Maybe it's a conversation starter. Saying that, hey, we've observed that you're using this in your environment. Can we understand a little bit more? Are you using it in places that also ingest PHI? Are you, or do you have like proper controls in place? And maybe they come around it. They maybe, who knows, they're going to see some sublimits included. And that just means, if you buy a policy that has $1 million of coverage, sublimit just means that your coverage for a loss in that particular area might be less than $1 million. And there's going to be some response in between. But the big reason, and this for all sorts of underwriter and insurer actions, is because there's real losses behind it. And these are not the losses that insurers like. These are what they call limit losses. They're very expensive. So again, you buy $1 million limit, that loss may be $1 million. There's class actions involved. Those are very protracted. They're expensive. And the amount of premium that you can charge for something like this is a drop in the bucket compared to maybe what the losses are here. So that's kind of where it's all coming from.
Emily, what can you share about like some of the reasons why exclusions and declinations are on the rise?
Yeah, and I think, Andrew's raised a lot of really good points which are relevant here, but I mean, they're on the rise for a few reasons. Firstly, frequency of litigation. So there's just been such a wave of class actions, particularly in the healthcare space, and I'm sure, as Andrew can agree, insurers are nervous about how widespread and costly those claims could become. Second, there's regulatory attention. Agencies like the OCR, attorney generals, they've made it clear that improper use of pixels can be treated as a privacy violation, which again is going to raise severity of potential losses. And then thirdly, there's still a lot of uncertainty in the coverage intent. Traditional cyber policies weren't really written with tracking technologies in mind. So insurers are, trying to limit their exposure until they can kind of wrap their arms around the risk and, better understand how courts and regulators are treating the cases. So I guess a combination of high frequency, regulatory pressure, and, some ambiguity around coverage.
This seems to be a trend, which is like a lot of the guidance and a lot of the ways that insurance is thought about, never considered web tracking, right? Like it's a new phenomenon. Emily, or Mallory, actually for you, what are some of the things that are actually, what are some of the legal theories beyond HHS that are driving some of these claims and class action lawsuits? Like what should people be worried about?
I mean, most of these claims that we're seeing are going to be based on, a privacy statute of sorts. So it's whether it's federal or state, the invasion of privacy part is the biggest part. You may see negligent misrepresentation if you're not properly disclosing, breach of contract if you've entered into some sort of contract with the provider. But, ultimately you're looking at, we've talked a bit about HIPAA. Obviously, if it's concerning a healthcare provider and PHI, that's, if you're not compliant, if you're required to be compliant with HIPAA and you are not, and you're sharing this PHI without consent, that is one theory. And then there's also the Video Privacy Protection Act, which initially was enacted with Blockbuster in mind back in the day, which is now seeing a resurgence because, people are on these websites and a video might pop up. So it's recording their viewing habits, which initially was what that statute was intended to protect, was the data around a consumer's viewing habits. So we're seeing class actions and litigation arising out of violation of the VPPA. Then you have wiretap acts, federal and state, because, is the pixel tracking your claim strokes, your form entries, your clicks. So that's another one. And then just state privacy laws. You have CCPA, which is sort of the most famous in California, the California Consumer Privacy Act. But all of those, I think the central theme is it's the invasion of privacy and a lack of consent, right? Because that's what's going to drive a lot of this is like, do the consumers know what data is being collected about them and their behaviors? And if not, that's when you run into these issues, which maybe you do have something in place, maybe you don't, but often the lawsuit will be filed first before you get to litigate all those issues. And then just sort of tying back to sort of what Emily and Andrew were saying, because these suits are still so new, relatively speaking, in the case law world, right? Like these suits really just started gaining traction in maybe 2020, 2021. So there's not a ton of data out there for the insurers to rely on, which is what they rely on in terms of underwriting and risk management, so they understand what the true loss is. So until they have more data, and we unfortunately see more of these lawsuits and where they're going, or maybe less, and then they know it's not as big of an issue as they thought. But it's probably not the way it's going to go. But that's how they gather more information. And we, new technology, it's a new risk, and insurers are weary of that until they have more data to support what the risk actually is.
Yeah, I've heard a data point that like from the class action lawsuit standpoint, it's been more than like 200 have been opened around the surface area. Does that sound like an accurate number?
Yeah, I think every year you're seeing more. I think the average, I was looking at some numbers before, and I think the average was 200 in a year, and it's tracking this year to be around a similar time. And that was, I think, just under, it might have been VPPA itself, the Video Privacy Protection Act was the 200 number. So that's not including some of these other state and federal privacy acts. But, I think for now, we'll probably see that continue at least consistently or on the rise as, pixel tracking continues and we try to figure it out a little bit more, and what companies become more knowledgeable about what they're doing and how to best sort of protect themselves from this litigation.
Yeah, shifting gears a little bit, Andrew, I'll start with you. Is when as a healthcare organization, when I start applying for cyber coverage, can you talk a little bit about what the insurers are actually evaluating in their tracking risk? Like, how are they assessing risk?
Yeah, so at its kind of core, the very like most distilled, you're looking at exposures versus controls, right? So your exposure is, when it comes to a particular type of loss, in this case, we're talking financial loss, what are you exposed to, right? Is that a very severe exposure? Is it a high likelihood of loss? So that's the start. And then underwriters are also looking as like, okay, well, what are the controls you have in place to help mitigate some of that risk? So good example is, I'm going to insure my house. It's, wood frame building, very susceptible to fire. And so my homeowner's insurance underwriter is going to look, well, do you have smoke detectors in place? Do you have, I don't know, do you have an open fire pit in your house to cook instead of a stove, right? Like those are not good. Do you have fire extinguishers, right? So that risk of fire, you've got some things that could mitigate it, that could help make a loss less severe. Okay. And so that's what they're looking at. And Emily alluded to this too. The worst kind of loss in insurance is high frequency and high severity, right? If you've got a high frequency type of loss, like, I don't know, you operate a grocery store, somebody tripping and falling, it happens pretty frequently, but it's a relatively not severe type thing, maybe a couple $1,000s here or there. Or if you've got something that doesn't happen a lot, but it could be millions of dollars, it's like, okay, well, maybe I'll take that risk if I can get enough premium for it. But here you got the like perfect storm of happens a lot, and oh, by the way, it's very expensive. And so underwriters are looking at that. That's why they scrutinize it so much, because they want to understand, like, okay, like if we're going to take a chance on this, we need to make sure that you've got proper controls in place. One, at the very least, what's going on. Maybe that like you have pixels in various parts of your web infrastructure. but you're also taking the steps to make sure that there's no improper collection, improper use. You have the right types of consent. You're gaining consent from users as they interact with your website, and you've got controls in place around maintaining the integrity and protection of that data once it's in-house. And yeah, like the pixel tracking, like it doesn't stay inside your four walls. It inherently leaves. And the fact that you share that, and then you couple in, you may or may not have consent to share that with a third party. And now you're looking at a violation of any number of privacy acts. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's what underwriters are looking for at the end of the day is this exposure that we're facing. Do you have it under control, or is this going to be a problem that shows up when you call our claims department?
Emily, you touched on this earlier about like some of these questions are showing up on applications. Would love for you to double click a little bit more there on how how clients are navigating that, and how like this high frequency of pixel specific questions is like interrupting the way they do things.
Sure. So what we're seeing now is that questions about tracking technologies are showing up very explicitly in the application process, particularly for healthcare clients. Just a year or two ago, clients might have only been asked very general questions about how they handle consumer or patient data. But today, the requests are going much further. As Andrew outlined, carriers are really going to drill down into the type of tools that you're using, be it Metapixel, Google Analytics, or other trackers that might transmit sensitive information. How you're obtaining consent for those trackers, whether privacy notices have been rigorously reviewed not only by the internal legal team, but outside counsel as well. And this has been an adjustment for some clients because now they have to coordinate across many different departments. The marketing and digital teams might be the ones who are using and installing these tools, but the risk managers and IT security are often the ones that are filling out the applications. So you need to often do an internal fact-finding process before you can even answer the questions accurately. And as with insurer applications more broadly, there isn't one standard question set in the marketplace when it comes to tracking technologies, nor is there a single approach to coverage. One carrier might treat pixel tracking as a gating issue that leads to exclusions or a higher retention or lack of coverage in that area, but another may simply ask for context and remediation steps. And insurers are really taking these answers seriously. In some case, just ticking yes to using a pixel tracker is going to trigger follow-up questions, additional underwriting scrutiny, or as I said, even some coverage limitations. So the way it shows up in practice is not to just tick a box. It's not just a box to tick. It's something that can directly impact whether coverage is offered, what terms look like, and whether exclusions may be applied.
Yeah, you're touching on this thing we talked about earlier, and it's something I saw very early was this misalignment between two different teams that like haven't really overlapped much in the past. Mallory, I'd love to talk a little bit more about that, this like marketing legal alignment. Like what are you seeing? Like I guess two-part question is like, what are you seeing, and like how are you seeing like a path forward where we can get a better understanding with this educational gap?
Sure. And I can speak sort of, from my in-house experience. This is something I dealt with frequently in terms of, you have to talk with your internal teams to figure out what they're doing. And it's hard to, you can't be sitting on top of everything they're doing or micromanaging. But what I tried to do with my team was sort of get rid of this idea of legal as being a blocker, because unfortunately that's oftentimes what teams are seeing legal counterpart as, is sort of the area of no. But what I tried to set with my teams, and I think hopefully legal and compliance teams can do this, is sort of set these open lines of communication with your teams that you want to work with them. You're not trying to block them. You're not trying to block progress. You're trying to find a solution and collaborate with them to figure out what can we do, what can we build that's going to be compliant, because ultimately if you spend all this time integrating and implementing something that turns out to be non-compliant or a liability issue because you haven't considered the consent you needed or whatever you might have needed to have in place, you're going to have to take all that work down. So you incur all this loss of time, all of this tech debt, and really it's detrimental to everyone, as opposed to everyone sort of kind of getting together at the start to kind of map out what we should do to make sure that no one is wasting their time or setting the company up for some unknowing liability risk that, you know, they may not have been aware of too, right? You know, oftentimes, you know, in the legal compliance world, we have this regulatory hat on, but, you know, your marketing team doesn't necessarily, that's not their focus, right? Their focus is how do we get engagement? How do we increase conversion? That's their focus. So it's kind of melding the two focuses and showing how they can work together and still, you know, it's not going to be a blocker. It's ultimately going to be a better experience for everyone.
I love that you brought that up because that is a lot of the conversation we have. In a perfect world, you know, legal would just make sure there were no pixels or trackers ever. And marketing would make sure they had all the data they needed to drive performance. And this is the point of conflict. And that is that is a really unique perspective that you gave, which is like, I'm generalizing, but marketers would rather just keep going and have all this data to drive performance and not be interrupted here. And they don't want to necessarily like touch this. But what you brought up is if you're not strategic with your legal and privacy team about this, you may end up getting derailed in the future. And that could be really hard to pivot from in a short period of time. So, and we have seen some of that. So really great perspective. Thanks for bringing that up. Emily and Andrew, anything else you would add here in this kind of tension between, you know, marketing and legal and kind of a conflict between their priorities?
You know, maybe I'll raise something and Andrew can let me know if he agrees, being the insurer. But, you know, when marketing, IT, and legal aren't aligned, you know, there is an issue that it can lower credibility with your insurer. I mean, if your application says one thing, but, you know, underwriters have done some research and, you know, realize that you're using pixels, or, you know, a claim comes in, you know, they're going to view that as a red flag, you know, which can cause issues for us on the broking side when we're trying to press for coverage. And then kind of the second issue is claims and regulatory exposure. If a breach or lawsuit arises and an insurer kind of discovers that the application responses weren't consistent and accurate in the first place, you know, could open the door to claim denials. So I would say that the main takeaway here really is consistency matters. And the organizations that are handling this really well are the ones that are kind of creating that cross-functional alignment up front.
I would echo that. I would also add, from an underwriting perspective, you know, it's not always just the answers to questions on an application. It's not always just about what a scan reveals, but you also step back and kind of look at the whole picture, and you're looking like, what is the attitude of this applicant, this policyholder, this insured. You know, do they have their stuff together? Do they care, right? Because that can go a long way into building a comfort level where, you know, it goes back to exposures and controls, you know, like the philosophy and the behaviors of leadership is a form of a control and mitigating risk. So, you know, if I was an underwriter and I was kind of on the fence, I would ask, like, do I feel like, you know, this team at my policyholder, are they going to have my best interest in mind? Are they going to, you know, try to do the right thing and protect their business? And if the answer is no, like if I'm on the fence, I may just say, I'll let that go to my competitor. Maybe they won't care, and it'll be their balance sheet that suffers. So yeah, it's having that proactive, you know, team first approach and solving problems. Because at the end of the day, I mean, it's a business risk. Like any kind of risk, you can do like three things with it. You can well, actually, I guess 4. You could avoid it altogether, right? In this case, it's unplugging all the servers, take everything offline. I'm just going to avoid the risk altogether. I can assume that risk, but you can only assume a risk if you have an open and honest conversation with it. And if you don't, then that's an uncontrolled risk, and that's the worst kind.
And that's right. It's a continuum, right? Like you can say that you have resources to defend yourself and plow ahead, or you can go to one extreme. But both of those are going to present like a whole range of problems.
Yeah, and I guarantee that no healthcare organization has hundreds of millions of dollars earmarked for responding and defending a class action. And so, unless you do, congratulations. That's an amazing financial position to be in. But otherwise, you're going to have to look to transfer that risk, and an insurer is going to have some questions for sure.
Yeah, I have seen organizations that have tens of millions of dollars earmarked for this. Then it becomes a question of, is there a better way to do it? And you don't have to spend tens of millions, but that's a whole nother topic. Just a reminder to all the attendees, we're going to save a little bit of time at the end for questions and answers. So please go ahead and use the Q&A box, and we'll make sure we get to as many as we can. The other thing I wanted to talk about, because we've been talking about what are pixels, what are the risks, and what should be thinking about is more just that, how do we move forward? So I guess maybe very specifically here, if we're advising healthcare organizations on how do you keep your coverage and control the premiums, what do we want to see on the application? Andrew, maybe I'll start with you.
I mean, kind of like as a tongue-in-cheek remark, but you want to take the easiest route, just don't use pixels. That's obviously not going to happen, right? Because the business benefit outweighs the risks in a lot of ways. So then it's just like, okay, how do I be smart about it? First and foremost, you're going to want to demonstrate that you understand what the exposure is, and that starts with having a full inventory and accounting of how you're using pixel and other tracking technologies in your digital footprint. That's a tall order in a lot of ways, but that's the first thing. So I want to be able to demonstrate that I know what my full exposure is, and then being able to document and demonstrate that you're taking the right steps along the way, and how do they adhere to best practices. How do they fall in line with regulatory requirements in your state? Because depending on how big the organization is and how broad their operation is, it may not just be one regulation or one state that you're dealing with. You may have multiple states. If you operate internationally, you've got a whole, so that's really what I would want to see from an underwriter. Is demonstrating that you know what the exposure is, that you're controlling it, and then you can demonstrate that it's actually working.
Emily, what would you add here?
I would say, from the broking side, what really helps us, with the application process is if we can guide clients to get ahead of the issue before it even reaches an underwriter. Much like Andrew said, that means usually a few things. First, kind of prompting clients to map out where pixels and trackers are actually in use. Clients might not know the full picture until they sit down and ask IT and marketing to really look into the issue. And then, secondly, going back to something we've all echoed, which is just making sure there's alignment across all of the teams so that the application responses are consistent and credible. And I think when, marketing, legal, risk, privacy are all on the same page, it's going to give insurers more confidence. And then, for us, framing the risk in context for underwriters, it's not realistic that everyone's going to stop using pixels. If we can explain what controls are in place, why they don't involve PHI, that narrative can make a big difference between a broad exclusion versus much more workable terms.
That's really helpful. Mallory, what about you? What would you add here?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are good points. And like Emily said, working with your broker so that they know what you're doing, what are your activities, what consents do you have in place. It can make sure that, when they're getting quotes from the cyber market that, are highlighting, actually, this policy is going to have a tracking exclusion on it. This one will do some carve back on that coverage if you do X, Y, and Z. Because I think, if you already have a coverage, cyber coverage in place, right? Or even if you're placing it for the first time, I think what's important to recognize is that no two cyber policies are going to be the same. They're not standardized forms like you see with your auto policy or your homeowner's policy. Cyber is ever evolving, right? There's new technologies coming out all the time. So these policies are changing to respond to that. That's why we have these pixel tracking or general web tracking exclusions, because typically an insurer doesn't know how to underwrite a risk. We're going to exclude it, and then we'll carve back once we figure out how to do so and manage the risk. But so it's important to understand what kind of coverage is on your cyber policy, because you may have a cyber policy that only is covering data breaches. And if you have that, then if you don't have the privacy coverage, then you're not covered for a privacy leak, right? You might only be covered if there was an active breach that occurred. Or do you have coverage for fines and penalties, right? Because some of these statutory, the damages awarded under the statutory penalties are going to be fines and penalties. So, you need to make sure you have the right coverage in place for whatever the risk is of your individual company. In working with sort of your broker, you can still kind of customize these cyber policies. So I think it's, working with your broker, making sure you understand what's covered under your policy and continually revisiting that, right? To make sure if your operations are changing, that you're updating your coverage along with that, or, updating your insurer if you've had any substantial changes to your risk profile to make sure you're not left in a position where you are not covered for a certain loss.
Before we get in, and there's some good questions coming in, so I want to make sure we have a little time for Q&A here. Before we do that, and we talked a little bit about this, that like insurers are waiting for more data so they can better assess the risk behind this. So this is going to be a little bit of a crystal ball question, if you're comfortable answering it. But it's like, what do you predict? Do you believe that insurers are going to become more flexible on these exclusions, or is this just a status quo that we're going to have to deal with? Maybe I'll start with you, Emily, and just get your opinion here.
Get my magic 8-ball and shake it up.
That's pretty much what I'm asking you to do. Yeah.
Being on the broking side, I'd like to say that I see insurers being more flexible. What I will say is that, that there's been a recent shift towards more exclusionary language. And I do think that really comes down to the uncertainty from the exposure at the moment. Perhaps when there's, more of an understanding of the losses and the true exposure, that we will start seeing some of that flexibility reappear. I will say that there is still coverage available in the marketplace. It's much more spotty now, and it is reserved for those with good controls. But it's, it goes back to the magic 8-ball. I wish I could have a definitive answer for you, but I think we need to let a little bit more time pass.
It depends. We'll see. How about?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. How about you, Andrew? What's your perspective here?
I'll offer a more definitive approach, and I'll say yes. It will eventually.
You're not a lawyer. That's why you're willing to do it, right?
Yeah. Well, even if I was, I would say, like, we're talking about pixel tracking technologies today, but this is a recurring theme in insurance. I mean, probably since the dawn of time, right? The dawn of insurance time is you've got this new evolving exposure, and it'll take some time. We're seeing it now currently with AI, but we've seen a few years ago with the rise of ransomware, And you pick your stunning event, state sponsored, cyber attacks and things like that. And yeah, the pendulum goes from very strict and stringent until you have a better understanding in a way of determining like what the actual exposure is and how you attribute and determine controls. And then, yeah, the flexibility comes back. So yes, I will say unequivocally, it will shift, but some things have to happen first. And that's really one, just being able to have a better understanding at scale of what the exposure is and how to determine it and find controls. And a big thing that hampers the insurance industry is the regulatory process, right? As new exposures and ways of loss can come online, those happen way quicker than insurers can pivot, because if they want to file a new coverage exclusion or raise rates on something, they have to go through up to 50 different departments of insurance. And that process can take anywhere from weeks to over a year. And so that's why there's that conservative approach at first, because they can't respond in real time. And so, yeah, so give it time. Things will change. But yeah, for right now, as Emily mentioned, like you got to work with a broker who's an expert, who knows the markets and can help you navigate that, because that's choppy right now.
And finally, how about you, Mallory? What's your view here?
I mean, I think what Emily and Andrew have said, it's time, and that ultimately is what we need here is more time. But I do think that we could potentially see some flexibility in terms of maybe not necessarily wholesale writing, not excluding entirely, but I think Andrew mentioned before, sublimiting, right? That's a way to cap your risk with respect to a certain type of claim, right? So maybe your coverage for pixel tracking claims is limited to, 100,000 or whatever it might be, right? They limit it to less than the total policy limit. Or, insurers write back sort of limited, I would keep saying carve backs, but basically, if an insurer shows that they have sort of those internal controls that we've talked about in place, can demonstrate the compliance and consent procedures that they might have users doing, how they're consenting to the sharing of the data, constantly updating the privacy policies, a privacy policy that reflects the actual operations of the business. Because often privacy policies kind of get done and then forget that we need to keep updating them as we update our businesses. So, I think to the extent of companies becoming more aware of sort of what they're doing internally, and then they can sell that to insurers, like, look at all the steps we're taking. Also, look, we didn't have any of these claims last year. Then maybe slowly you can see some of the coverage be written back in, maybe not on a fulsome scale, but bit by bit, maybe some sublimiting and slowly adding as they kind of get a better picture of the full sort of the full landscape of this claims, as we just have a greater loss history as years go on.
Yeah, to Emily's point about the crystal ball of what insurers are going to do, that's going to take some time. But what you're bringing up is there are actions we can take from the healthcare organization side to help like de-risk ourselves and have a little bit more control here. And, just a reminder to all the attendees, that's in the series, we're going to go a little bit deeper here into some of those things people can do. So if you want to be, get episode 2 and 3, use this little QR code and register. This was an awesome discussion, and we've had a lot of really great questions that I think we've kind of triggered along the way. So I want to try to get to as many of them as possible. Maybe I'll start. This is probably for Mallory and Emily. One of the questions, because we talked about the state wiretapping laws and CCPA and VPPA. I guess that was the question is like, how do these laws impact pixel tracking? Like what is their connection? I think is really what this person is asking for.
So for wiretapping laws specifically, wiretapping, they're kind of closely aligning that with sort of what you're doing on your computer, right? So when your pixels are tracking your behavior, so your clicks, like what you're clicking on, what you've entered, what forms you're entering on a particular site because you're entering in your information for some reason, what you view, what you push play on or submit. So all of that is going to be potentially considered under this wiretapping, the wiretapping laws. And so when you have the pixel tracking exclusions, like that can then apply back to the wiretapping laws. I will say though, I don't know, perhaps this is something that would be good for a future future session for some of the privacy lawyers, because they'll have a little bit more in-depth and insight into exactly what's going on with wiretapping litigation. And they can kind of provide some more insight there.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
I agree with Mallory. I was just going to add one thing that
please do.
I will say, just because CPPA has been specifically mentioned, that, you know, the CPPA does go further because it does require disclosure of all forms of tracking. So I would say, it is dependent on what state you're operating in, but certainly California's requirements are higher than others. Sorry, my voice has decided to.
It's okay. We've asked you to participate for 52 minutes, so that's fair. This kind of touches on something that I think that there's a lot of confusion around. Would love to just chat about this for a second. You know, there's the cookie consent management, the pop-ups that you see on a lot of websites, even not related to healthcare. And I think there's a lot of confusion about what level of consent. Is that enough? Like if I put a cookie acceptance or decline button on my website, is that enough to mitigate a lot of the risks that we've talked about today? Would love to hear the perspective there.
There's one thing I'll just say before I pass to Mary and/or Andrew, who may be better to answer this question. But back to the CPPA and the CPRA, because they do require you to disclose all tracking technologies, a standard disclosure of consent in a cookie banner may not be enough. So it does force you to take an additional look at your consents and your privacy policies.
100%. There's also a key difference between cookies and, say, a pixel tracker. Cookies are stored sort of on your browser, right? So they're not going to follow you when you close out your browser and track your activity across multiple avenues, right? Because that information is going to be stored, and you can easily clear that out. You can clear your cookie browser, your cookie history, right? And you have a better control of that. Whereas with pixels, those are, we talked about at the beginning, like those are hidden. So it's not, and that data is getting transmitted to a third party. So the consumer then loses sort of control, that the same kind of control they would have with a cookie. So when you have those cookie banners, a cookie is sort of less, there's less concern from sort of a privacy perspective over a cookie versus pixel tracking, just because of the control of that data that's being transmitted. So like Emily said, the banner, while it's good to have, it may not necessarily be enough, particularly if there's any, if we're talking about personally identifiable information, protected health information, where you really should have those affirmative consents in place. Whether that's a checkbox or, pops up about the privacy policy they're popping up, however you want, there's different ways to do it. But usually you would probably need more than just a banner when we're talking about more intricate and involved tracking technologies.
Yeah, that was helpful to touch on, because one of the other questions we have are pixels and cookies in the same category from a legal perspective. And I think you just answered that. Andrew, anything that you would add here from your perspective on, ways like, I think there is a misconception for a lot of people that the cookie banner kind of just like gets the consent that they need. And anything that you would add here?
No, I think it's been covered. But yeah, I would say, first and foremost, be very, very familiar with the regulations that you're subject to, depending on one, where you're domiciled, two, where you operate, and then even more is where do your customers and the people you serve live, because oftentimes, like, even with like the California consumer privacy, that's not like, it doesn't just affect companies that operate in California. It also is triggered by if you've got customers that are California residents. So heck, you could be in North Carolina and still be subject to CCPA. So yeah, just be very, very familiar, be very conservative when it comes to how you approach those things, and always ask the questions.
There's another question, and this is a little bit on the technical side. I'll frame it like most healthcare organizations have an agency they work with, and they usually use a tool called Google Tag Manager that helps manage like the triggers that say like this data should be fired to this tool. I'll share my perspective, and I would love to hear any feedback from the panel. From all of our research, Google Tag Manager itself isn't really an issue. The issue is when you have specific data that you then fire and share with a downstream destination. So if you're using Google Tag Manager and it's just a free-for-all and you're just using it like pre-HHS guidance in 2022, and you're sending all the data down to Google Analytics, or you're sending all the data down to Meta, that's where this becomes a problem. It's really that data sharing that could be really sensitive data that's being shared with, let's just take the non-charitable view, destinations that don't care about privacy. They just want to use all the data they can to perform at their maximum capability. I don't know if there's anything anybody wants to add there as it relates to Google Tag Manager specifically as a risk.
I can provide something from the underwriter's perspective.
That's great.
And the reason why it's kind of a binary decision where if you see a tracker, you kind of raises a red flag is from the outside perspective, you don't know what kind of data is being transmitted. So you have to assume the worst, so to speak. And so you just have to go in thinking like, if I see this, I'm just going to assume whatever data that they have access to is going to be transmitted and it is no longer, protected. And then the question arises like, okay, given the operation of this company, what kind of data is realistic that they're going to be coming into? And so if it's a healthcare organization, yeah, I'm going to assume there's a treasure trove of PHI. And now you combine the two and you're like, oh yeah, like I have to assume, unless I'm proven otherwise, that this is just an active exfiltration of PHI with likely without consent and doing it properly. So yeah, it's going to be much easier to exclude that or decline it versus having a very detailed conversation.
And I swear I didn't plant this one, but we'll close with this one. Whoever did this was kind of a gift of FreshPain, is how do you implement pixels in a compliant way? My short answer will be like, reach out to FreshPain, we help here. But my longer answer will be, it's really, really difficult to utilize native tracking technologies and pixels in a compliant way. But maybe Mallory, I'll end with you to see if you have any thoughts here.
Yeah, I mean, I think making sure your team, we talked about this, knowing what sort of data you're ingesting and what trackers you may be utilizing is first step, just having knowledge, right? And then secondly, making sure you have a consent process in place, right? However you're deciding to disclose it, there's various layers of risk depending on the consent process you choose, right? So the banner may not be enough. Do you have a link to click? Do you have a checkbox to check off? It sort of depends sort of on your individual risk assessment in terms of what is the type of data that you're taking in. Like, with PHI, you'd want to be at sort of the highest level of sort of over disclosing, if you will, and making sure you're getting the confirmative consents in. And also, do you have a BAA that enables you to kind of take in this information. So there's sort of a heightened risk there. But if you're taking in information that's maybe not going to fall under sort of the PAI realm, could you take a less cautious approach in terms of how you're going to do your consents? Because I know I would always get questions or pushback from teams. We don't want to put in another step because that's going to hurt our conversion, which I heard a lot. So, and I understand that it's a valid point, but I think you just have to balance like the desire for conversion versus your desire for compliance and see how the risk is going to balance out.
Yeah, well, thank you, Emily and Mallory and Andrew. What a like gangbuster talent on this panel, and I learned a lot from y'all. And then thank you to all the attendees for staying with us throughout the conversation.